Society of Adaptation Professionals. I'm Patrick Marchman. I'm helping to run herd on this call. Lily Swanbauer-Becker, who's usually our tech guru who fixes everything, is at a meeting this week. So Beth Gibbons has helpfully volunteered to sit in to help record things as well. So I'm sorry about that. I'm getting over a cold. Luckily, we're doing this virtually, so nobody has to worry about getting sick. So anyway, thanks so much. And I think we'll just get started by starting a roll call. And I think we have maybe we have enough people here, so I'll start. I'm Patrick Marchman. As I mentioned before, I'm leading this group. I'm also hazard mitigation planner with Michael Baker International and Resilience Action Partners, supporting FEMA Region 7 in Kansas City, Missouri. So let me get the whole list of people and start calling some names as to who I see. Beth, do you want to just introduce yourself briefly and then go back on mute?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I'm Beth Gibbons. I'm the Executive Director of ASAP. I'm based in Ypsilanti, Michigan, and happy to be filling in for Lily this afternoon and really looking forward to hearing David's presentation.
Great, thank you. Caroline Reeser. Probably mispronounced that. Caroline, it looks like you're still on mute. All right, we will come back to you, and it looks like everybody's on mute, so I guess Beth might need to let people off too. Alicia Rates, you just showed up. Okay, let's try, see who else is not on mute. Okay, Caroline, it looks like you're not on mute. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Can everyone hear me? I think I still am on mute.
I think, no, you are not on mute.
Oh, excellent. Hi, everyone. This is Caroline Reeser. I work with the American Flood Coalition in Washington, D.C., and this is my first time joining this call.
Great. Well, welcome. Appreciate you being here. Let's see. SP Dalkey.
Hi. Can you all hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hi. So I'm Stephanie Dalkey. I'm with the Environmental Finance Center at the University of Maryland. This is also my first call, although I've been getting the meeting announcements for quite a while and always had conflicts. So I'm glad to finally be able to join in. The EFC here, we work in Region 3 of EPA, so Pennsylvania, Maryland, Delaware, Virginia, West Virginia, the District of Columbia, and obviously Maryland.
Great. Well, welcome. It's always good to have first-time people. We like that. Colin Chan.
Right. Hi. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, great. My name's Colleen. I'm an adaptation specialist here at First Street Foundation, based in Brooklyn, New York.
Great, thank you. And I will try to remember Colleen next time. Thank you. Deborah Butler.
Hi, everyone. This is Deborah Butler. I'm a PhD student, PhD candidate now at UMass Boston, and I'm working as a program assistant with ASAP.
Great. Heidi.
Hello, I am also with the University of Maryland. Hello, Stephanie. And I have actually had some experience with this topic and practicing real estate law for a long time and being involved in the finance side of it. And I've taught classes on these topics, and I'm really excited to see the picture of Smith Island, Maryland. So I'm looking forward to your presentation, David.
Awesome, great. Let's see who is next. Jack Leibster.
Hi, I'm Jack Leibster from the County of Marin. I'm the Advanced Planning Manager, and we've been working on sea level rise for about 6 years. And you may know us through our original Game of Thrones, which was adapted by USDN for other areas.
Great, thank you. Joyce Coffey.
Hi, this is Joyce Coffey, based in Chicago with Climate Resilience Consulting. And I work with cities and the nonprofits and philanthropies that support cities in their resilience strategies.
Great, welcome. Alicia Race. Hi, Alicia. All right, we will try to come back to you one last time later. Katie Spitaglieri.
Hi, everyone. My name is Katie Spitaglieri, and I work at the Georgetown Climate Center located in Washington, D.C.
Great. S. Udvardi.
Good afternoon, everyone. This is Shauna Udvardi with I'm the Climate Resilience Analyst with the Union of Concerned Scientists, and Alicia Race is here at UCS as well.
Oh, great, awesome. Susie Moser.
Hi, everyone. It's Susie Moser. I've been working as an independent researcher and consultant based in Hadley, Massachusetts, far from the coast, and so I'm very interested in the receiving communities aspect of managed retreat.
Great. And Kristen Kelleher.
Hi, yes, sorry for joining on the later side, but I've been involved in the Climigration Network. I work for a Climate Action Business Association, where a nonprofit that helps businesses take action on climate change. And in our Businesses Acting on Rising Seas campaign, we spoke with a number of businesses in vulnerable areas about how to prepare for climate change impacts and you know, the risks that they're seeing, and you know, the necessary steps. And some of these communities, managed retreat is going to have to be the solution. So I'm very interested in kind of hearing how we can communicate that and talk about that and, you know, move forward towards solutions.
Great. And lastly, Vidya.
Hi, this is Vidya with the Illinois Coastal Management Program based out of Chicago, Illinois. I'm interested in learning about managed retreat as a solution to severe erosion caused due to lake level rise, which is now an emerging threat to many of our coastal communities.
Great, welcome. Yeah, so anybody else joins, we will not put them on a hot seat, but yeah, so thanks everybody for joining, and we'll just get started. So just as a brief introduction, David Casagrande is with Lehigh University and has done some really interesting work relating to managed retreat. And a lot of this is personal relevance to me, supporting FEMA. FEMA is sort of an 800-pound gorilla in the United States. When you're talking about managed retreat, you eventually end up talking about FEMA. So this is a hugely controversial, you know, area in a lot of ways, but it's really interesting to kind of get behind, you know, what people are thinking, because a lot of times, at least in our bailiwick, it's a lot of, you know, here's just the mechanics of it. But looking at more of the human side, I think, is not only interesting, but it also helps facilitate doing this in a much more effective and equitable and, frankly, kind way. That may be the best adjective. So without further ado, and I'm sure I've totally mangled and missed the point of David's research, but I will shut up and turn the ball over to him. So, David, you have the floor.
Thanks, and thank you for having me. This is a great opportunity. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation with everybody. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned, and your description of my research was very accurate. And I'm glad you mentioned the aspect of sort of compassion about all of this, because I think one of the things that we tend to lose track of, especially in academia, is that the ultimate goal here is to improve people's quality of life. And that really cannot be done in a way that really violates a lot of their desires. And one of the things we've learned in our research that I'll talk about is the power of consensus when it comes to engaging in these kinds of processes. So the two pictures I have here are from the two areas that I've done the bulk of this research. Starting in the Midwest in 2009, along the Mississippi River in Illinois, in Missouri and Iowa. And then more recently moving over to the Chesapeake area. And the picture that I have here of Smith Island is a king tide. This isn't a flood event. This is actually tidal flooding. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that's becoming more and more of a problem in the Chesapeake area. So I won't spend a lot of time on some of these slides, but I left a lot of detail on them because I've sent the slides to be uploaded onto the Google Drive. So if anybody wants to look at these in more detail, they can do so later. So I'll probably skip over a lot of this stuff, especially since I know for many of you this is all review. But the climate is changing, and a lot of people tend to think about coastal areas, but also there is a lot of inland flooding that's increasing as a result of climate change. And in particular on the Mississippi, we're looking at more frequent and more intense pulses of water coming down and contributing to levee failure. And that's certainly accelerating. And I think that, as I'll point out with the survey we did, people are aware of this. And so they're thinking about it at least. Also, I don't want to spend too much time on the voluntary buyout process, especially since there's some FEMA people here who probably know a lot more about it than I do. But suffice it, it's this last point on this slide that I think is particularly important. And just let me ask, are you all seeing the slides?
Yes.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. So even though the FEMA buyout process is a community decision and it has to be put forward to the state emergency management agency for approval, it really is forcing individuals to make decisions, and quite often that individual homeowners, I should say, to make decisions about whether they're going to take the buyout or not, and that, as we all probably know, leads to some dissension. And I'll talk a little bit about this idea of wholesale community relocation as we've documented and researched in the Midwest, and how that might be an opportunity to overcome some of that. One of the ideas that we're toying with is this idea of structural bias, which is a term that's historically been used in engineering, but I think social psychologists that I work with are also social psychologists, sociologists, and anthropologists who are looking at this, this idea of managed retreat are starting to think about this from a more public perspective. And so when we talk about structural bias, we're talking about this idea for people to prefer structural solutions like you see in this picture in order to avoid really difficult decisions. Relocating a house, relocating a town is an extremely difficult decision. And I work a lot with the cognitive dissonance theory. And we know that we, as humans, really try to avoid really difficult decisions that create a lot of cognitive dissonance. And so one of the ways we can escape that is just by sort of advocating for these structural solutions. This particular picture I took was in 2013, and although you can't quite get the perspective from the photograph, the Mississippi River is probably about 12 feet higher than the street in the little downtown of Cape Girardeau. And so this happens quite frequently. And it's this idea that this is a typical structural solution to the issue. It's not possible for everybody. If we go upstream a little bit more to Clarksville, Missouri, that's a town that has based its identity on its connection to the river. And they point to Girardeau, Cape Girardeau, as an example of what they never want to be. So the structural solutions quite often don't work for everybody for a lot of different reasons. And they just might not be technically or economically feasible, especially in smaller communities. So we started doing research around 2009 in the Midwest. These are some of the questions we were looking at. What are the impediments to relocation? And in particular, this idea of relocating entire towns. What survey variables might best predict attitudes about relocation? And what are some of the socio-psychological processes that are involved in actually contributing to people's definitions of risks and their attitudes about relocation, and what this might tell us about policy. Again, I don't want to dwell on this too much because the slide is there for people to look at, but our research is informed by two theoretical perspectives. And the first comes from Mary Douglas, who was an anthropologist, who basically proposed this idea that what you choose to pay attention to when it comes to risk is really a cultural decision, and a lot of it has to do with your identity, your morals, and the boundaries of the group that you belong to. And I already mentioned this idea of cognitive dissonance, and the one point I want to make about this that often gets lost in the academic discourse is that when people's make predictions and those predictions don't come true, that disconfirmation actually usually never results in people changing their minds or their opinions. Quite often people will take other strategies, and one is trying to more aggressively convince other people of their opinions by proselytizing, which is something that we found interesting to see in the Chesapeake area. So the first, I'm going to talk about two case studies, one in the Midwest and one in the Chesapeake. In the Midwest, we're looking at this area of the middle of the Mississippi River and these floodplains that are heavily farmed, divided up into drainage districts, and almost entirely behind 100-year levees, not 500-year levees. So the research involved talking to a lot of people, an ethnographic component, where we did focus groups, a lot of interviews, participant observations. I filled a lot of sandbags along the Mississippi River with people. And we also did a lot of hydrological risk modeling. And we did a survey, I think it was about a little over 600 households that we ended up with responses from. And we were trying to ascertain, based on what we heard in focus groups and interviews and everything, what were some of the things that were contributing to people's attitudes about several flood mitigation options that are listed over here on the lower right, such as elevating homes, buying flood insurance, restoring wetlands, but most relevant to today's topic, I'll only talk about buyouts and relocations. So first I want to talk about some of the themes that emerged from the focus groups and the interviews, and then I'll talk about the survey results briefly later. But it was interesting when we analyze these data, what we find is a lot of people engage in what's called social comparison. And the most extreme example I heard about this, was I was interviewing a woman in Illinois, and she was telling me about how the levee had broke. Most of the houses were filled with about 4 to 5 feet of water when a tornado came through and damaged more houses. And so it's occurring to me that this is a fairly dangerous place to live. And I asked her, I said, so do you think this is a risky place to live? And she said, oh no, it's nowhere near as dangerous as California, where they have earthquakes and wildfires and all of these other storms. And so this is an example of social comparison, this idea that quite often, as bad as things get, people will also say, well, other people have it worse. People talked a lot about quality of life, community, and sense of place, but I think it's really important to understand how much of it was focused on these institutions like schools and churches. So when we first started this research, we were more interested in how communities recover after disasters. And what became obvious in all the towns we went to, and we did work in, I think, including last summer, we're now up to something like 30 towns where we've done a lot of interviews and focus groups. And in almost every case where there was a disaster, people talked about the first thing they wanted was to get the school back up and running. And that's really important for a couple of reasons. One is that the children are experiencing stress, and so as fast as you can get them back into a normal situation, the less stress they'll experience. But also it's a symbol. It's a symbol of the integrity of the town. And if the school doesn't reopen and people start to enroll their students in a school in the next town over, it's quite likely they might not be coming back. And so it's this example of losing the core institution that provides a basis for the identity of the community. So schools are really, really important. People talked a lot about that. And they also talked about this idea that people that are taking the buyouts or want to take the buyouts are abandoning their community. And the most extreme example I had encountered of this was a farmer who lived in the Illinois floodplain, and his house had been flooded and damaged 3 times, and he absolutely refuses to move out of the floodplain. And the reason is he considers it his moral obligation to his community to remain. So he has his house arranged. He has a large trailer and he has a semi. He's a farmer. So he has a trailer out back of his house, and when his flood is coming, he can roll up his carpets, he can take his cabinets off the wall, he puts them into the truck, and he takes them to his brother's house. And I asked him, why is it so important to live there? And he said, well, if people like me move away, then they will not continue to maintain the roads or the levee. And what you'll end up with is the few people who do need to be here to work or work in the grain elevator won't have the infrastructure they need. So he considers it his moral obligation to remain in the floodplain. Something that I'm sure many of you are aware of is this idea that if you could buy people out within 3 months, you would have huge success rates. But of course, the process takes years, and that is probably the greatest impediment to post-flood buyouts. People get frustrated, they start rebuilding their houses, they just can't wait for that amount of time. What we found really interesting was that people really didn't appreciate how risky this was to their lives. They really talked about risk primarily, from a financial perspective. And this really became apparent with Biggert-Waters 2012, which you may be aware was a legislative act that would phase in the real actuarial rates of the flood risk. And there were a lot of town meetings in our research area where people were being informed that their insurance was going to go up significantly. And they made comments like, I had no idea it was that risky to live where I live. So it's clear the risk wasn't being registered as part of their physical safety, but once they understood the equity of their house was in jeopardy, all of a sudden they appreciated how risky it was. So these are the things that I think are interesting to think about when we talk about risk communication. So people also talked a lot about buying out individual homes is eroding the tax base, and then the town, of course, assumes ownership of the property, has to maintain it, and so on. But a lot of people, these are a lot of small rural Midwest communities with very strong senses of community, and they didn't like this idea that everybody would be scattered and go to different towns. Many of these people go back to about 1812 when the area was first settled by Europeans. So we spent a lot of time in Valmeyer, Illinois, which is one of the most commonly cited stories of relocating an entire town. I should point out, not everybody left. There's still about a half a dozen homes down in the floodplain, but most of the people did relocate high up onto the bluff where they built a new town. And we can talk a lot about what success actually means. And I know A.R. Siders and I are having a conversation. We want to look at some of our data and see if there's some ways of measuring success. But the mayor of Valmeyer, Dennis Knobloch, really talked about things like, have you maintained the population? So before the floods of '93, the population was about 900. After they relocated the town, about 600 people came back, and the population now is about 1,000. So this is a town that's actually grown as a result of relocating in a rural area that's in significant decline. Property values are worth more than they were before, and for most part, people are satisfied. They miss the old town. There's no doubt they miss the old town, but every time it looks like it's going to flood and levees are going to fail, they feel so much happier about having moved. So there's some nostalgia. Pattonsburg and Rhineland, Missouri are also examples of towns that tried to relocate entirely. And I throw these up here because one of the points I want to make is that most of these projects that have been successful and a lot of people have relocated have relied a lot on local leaders with a vision. And the vision, especially in these areas, about what a rural community can be in the future instead of thinking about what it was in the past. And so because of farm consolidation that started in the 1980s, most of these downtowns were in decline. There were a lot of abandoned retail and commercial properties. And so these leaders saw FEMA buyouts and relocation of entire communities as a way to create a town that was more sustainable for the future. And so Pattonsburg, Rhineland, for example, moved the town to be close to the new highway, so they would be near the exit. More people will relocate if the whole town is going. So I believe this is an important point to consider if we're trying to get more people to relocate. In all cases, first people had to overcome this structural bias. The levees were never going to be fixed to a point where they were going to be safe. Once they understood that, then they could talk more seriously about relocating. In the meantime, they will lobby and lobby and lobby for structural solutions rather than make the really difficult decision about relocating. And this is not only true for these towns, but I know Elizabeth Marino has told me it was the same thing in Shishmaref, Alaska. First, they wanted the structural solutions, and it wasn't until they understood those structural solutions were not feasible that they seriously considered relocating. And then, of course, time and funding are the biggest impediments. So a lot of people, 85% of the people who responded to our survey agreed that it's flooding more frequently, and it's a problem. A lot of people who thought that they would flood in the next 15 years do not have flood insurance, which is an interesting statistic. But this is one that really caught me, was this idea that a lot of these people cannot afford to sell their house and leave. They're stuck there. These are houses that have been in the family maybe for a couple of generations. They might be worth $20,000 or $30,000. If you sold that to somebody, first, it's almost impossible to find a buyer because they're rural areas with no jobs. But if you could sell them, you probably wouldn't be able to buy comparable housing somewhere else for the same amount of money. So they're financially stuck. You would think these would be the people who would want to take the buyouts. And in some cases, that's true. But in some cases, it's not, for all of the other reasons I've been talking about. Okay, so here's an important point. Most of the people, about 77%, said they would support buyouts, FEMA buyouts of properties after their, and this is in general. This is a question about, do you think this is something we should be doing in general? Most people agree, but only about half would agree to pre-flood buyouts. So it's this idea that the flood has to have happened to prove that it's really dangerous for us to make this investment. So that tells you a little bit about public support. Okay, so I just wanted to check the time because I can't see the clock on my computer. So I think it's important to remember that like risk perception is heavily financialized in our culture, which is highly capitalistic, and that's the lens through which we see a lot of the world. But there are also a lot of these other moral implications, like things like loyalty to neighbors and the integrity of the community, that turn out to be, I think, a lot more important in the Chesapeake. So why should we pay all of this money to relocate an entire community? I think it's because more people are likely to move if their whole community moves. You preserve the tax base. In fact, Valmeyer, Illinois has increased its tax base. You preserve these important cultural institutions like schools and churches. All 3 churches in Valmeyer moved to the new Valmeyer. I can't see all of the slide here, but okay, so these people that couldn't afford to sell a house would probably be more likely to do so if there was a community-based buyout program. But it requires additional funding for infrastructure, which is what we're seeing in Ile-des-Jeunes-Charles. And this idea of uncertainty and the years it takes is probably the biggest impediment to relocating entire communities. Dennis Knobloch will tell stories forever about what he had to do for 18 months to keep this community together while they went through all of the different roadblocks before they actually broke ground in the new town. So local leadership is absolutely crucial. And I know a lot of what we try to do is provide that leadership from outside. And I think it's, from what I've seen in some of these places, and we tried to do this in Olive Branch, Illinois. My team actually tried to relocate the village of Olive Branch, Illinois, based on the Valmeyer experience. And there's just no substitute for grassroots local leadership being the people that are initiating the vision. So I think it's important for us as external practitioners actually to identify who those key people might be and leverage them if they can develop some sort of a vision. So now I'll switch over to talking about the research that we're doing in the Chesapeake. For those who may not know, because of isostatic glacial rebound, a lot of the eastern shore of the Chesapeake and even some of the western shore places like Annapolis are actually sinking because of tectonic subsidence, withdrawal from the aquifer, and a few other reasons. At the same time, sea level is rising. So the relative sea level rise in this area is much more rapid than other parts of the East Coast. My family lives on the coast of Connecticut, and it's nowhere near as rapid as it is on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake. So a lot of these towns are starting to experience these high tides, these king tides. They used to come 2 or 3 times a year, started coming once a month, and now they're becoming more and more frequent, and it really starts to interfere with local businesses. And I know somebody in the introductions was talking about working with businesses. We did interviews of restaurant owners in places like St. Michael's, and they're having to close on some Saturdays because people can't, their parking lot is basically knee deep in water. So it's starting to have a real impact on the businesses in these areas. So what this map is actually showing, this area that includes Blackwater National Wildlife Refuge, if you can see it, is in Dorchester County, which is the county that's projected to lose the most amount of its land mass over the next 30 years. And this is, I think, to me, it was shocking when I first saw it. We're not talking about 2100. We're talking about over the next 30 years, 60% of the land mass in this county is going to be permanently inundated. And so you would think this is where local residents and local governments would be very, very, very focused on managed retreat or relocation. And some people are, but for the most part, people are not. And I went to Smith Island originally because I had read that there was a buyout package proposed for Smith Island after Hurricane Sandy. And at first it looked like there were about 10 homeowners on the island who wanted it. But then eventually the county voted it down. So a lot of people were bitter about that. It created a lot of animosity. Some of those people who want the buyouts were marginalized. Again, this idea that you're a traitor, you're not being loyal to your community, and so on. And these particular pictures were actually given to me by a woman on Hupper's Island who literally a couple of days of the month has to put her child in a canoe to get the child to the bus. This is her front yard. And when she bought the house about 15 years ago, it was just a lawn, and it is essentially converted into a salt marsh. She is desperate for a buyout, but because the county won't approve any kind of a package, she can't get it. So this is an example of how conflict develops inside of these small communities. So we haven't done a survey yet. We're trying to apply for an NSF grant to do a similar survey as we did in the Midwest in the Chesapeake. So in the meantime, we've just done interviews with homeowners, business owners, as I mentioned, county planners, and emergency managers, and we've analyzed those. This is an area where your livelihood quite often does depend on being close to the water. And I should point out, in the Midwest, some of these towns don't really have a reason to be on the Mississippi River. They actually were there only because that's where the railroad was. And so now it's actually makes sense for them to move up near the highway or something like that. It's a little different in the Chesapeake. If you're a waterman and you're harvesting blue crabs and oysters, there's really nowhere else for you to go. So that's, I think, sets up a different context. A lot of the people we talk to, and again, I want to emphasize, there are recent people who are retirees from urban areas like DC and Baltimore who have moved out there. But a lot of the people, we don't know exactly how many because we haven't done a survey to quantify how many people feel this way. But a lot of people we talked to really did sort of conceptualize the risk of climate change or the risk of flooding along lines of their political ideology and group identity, which is pretty much exactly what Mary Douglas was predicting. And so we heard comments like this. And a lot of people just refuse to accept that climate change is real and sea level is rising, and what they see is erosion. And when they see ghost forests, which are these forests where all the trees die because of saltwater incursion, they blame pine bark beetles. There are pine bark beetles. There is a lot of erosion. The pine bark beetles and erosion has gotten significantly worse because of saltwater incursion and because of rising sea level, according to scientists. But the local people really want the discourse to focus on erosion. And the reason is there's a structural solution for erosion. There's not a structural solution for the existential threat of rising sea level. So I'll skip over the theoretical parts of this, but basically, instead of doing the buyouts, they formed something called Smith Island United, which was a group that was really effective at putting together a vision for what the island should be, tourist development, all this kind of stuff. But their big project was lobbying for an erosion control project on the north end of the island at Rhodes Point, which was successful. And this is an example of the structural bias that I've been talking about. I know this group is interested in adaptation. And so one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly was this idea in the discourse of how this problem of chronic tidal inundation is normalized in the discourse. And the picture that you're seeing here is what people talked about on Smith Island, their saltwater car or their tide car. And so, you know, if you drive a car through salt water, it's going to ruin the car because the salt water will corrode the brakes and all this other kind of stuff. So they go to the mainland and they buy a cheap car that, you know, only costs about $300 or $400. They take it to Smith Island so they don't have to get it registered. And they just drive it around during the floods. And so they have a car that's just for the times when the tide is high. They talk about buying higher boots. But one of the more interesting ones was this idea that they'll take turns driving their children, not on Smith Island, but on some of the mainland areas like Hupper's Island. Well, they'll take turns driving their children to as far as the bus can get because the bus really doesn't want to be driving through salt water either. And so this idea of normalizing this inconvenience is something that actually starts to become a source of community pride. And you're creating a situation where the adaptation is normalized, which is in some way psychologically good, but it also precludes thinking about really serious decisions like relocating. And we had a lot of people who talked to us just because they thought we would bring the message to elected officials or the Army Corps of Engineers or whoever would listen, that the problem is erosion. And that's what we've got, we audio record everything, and people are telling us, you have to go tell everybody it's erosion. Don't let them talk about climate change. We need erosion control processes. And so this is kind of what Leon Festinger had predicted with cognitive dissonance theory. So again, I want to, it's very similar to the Midwest in this idea that the perceptions of risks are based on your group identity, and the way you talk about things becomes a norm, which we call normative discourse. But this is really where you start to see if people are talking to themselves this way, it starts to deviate significantly from state policymakers and local policymakers. And a lot of the county emergency management, especially in Dorchester County, the emergency managers are very, very concerned because they don't want to be driving their equipment through salt water. And there are several days of months now where you wouldn't be able to get a fire engine or an ambulance to somebody who needs it who's living out at the end of a road like this that you see in the picture here. So just to conclude with some general observations, I think this idea that when we're talking about small communities relocating, it was pretty consistent that people want to avoid this diaspora and maintain their cultural institutions. A lot of people talk about the risk as financial. Even the woman who really, really wanted the buyout in the Chesapeake, whose child was in the canoe, she talked about everything from the perspective of losing the equity of her house. She talked a little bit about danger, she talked about inconvenience, but really it was this idea that her house is essentially worthless because it's now sitting on a tide marsh. So when we're talking with people, I think it's important to realize that if we're trying to develop some sort of consensus within a community to relocate, that people are really making a trade-off between their perception of risk, which is highly financialized, their moral values, and this idea that they really have to overcome their structural bias before they'll seriously consider any type of a relocation. And it seems to be harder to do. I should say the team I work with put together a database of all the relocations that have happened where they've tried to relocate entire towns, and they've either failed or succeeded. And almost all the successes are in the Midwest. None of them are on the East Coast. And so we found that interesting. So I think in general, the public and local practitioners are supportive of relocation, a managed retreat. We're not getting an awful lot of support from the federal level, but perhaps that might change. This focus on trying to get individual property owners to make a decision to relocate can be effective in some places, like perhaps Staten Island, but in these smaller communities, I think it's more effective to talk about relocating entire communities. But this means we need some sort of dedicated funding, federal funding for infrastructure and to really streamline the process. So that's all I have to say about the research. And at this point, I guess we can just have a conversation if anybody's interested.
Thank you, David. That was a fascinating presentation. I know I have a question or two, but first I want to open it up to anybody else. Does anybody have any questions they'd like to ask?
I have a question, Susie. I'm wondering, David, whether you have already published some of your findings and whether maybe if you can share your slide deck and maybe put the references at the end or something, if there are any. It's great.
So yes, I'll share the slides. I don't have any references in the slides, but I can put some in and resend it. As far as the publications are concerned, we've only had a few. The Chesapeake work, we're just starting to write up now. And so I'm afraid there aren't any publications on that yet.
David, this is Heidi Bulich. Thank you very much for your presentation. It's sobering to listen to your conclusions. My question relates to infrastructure. And a couple times you referenced funding for infrastructure, but has there been any research done on the infrastructure that the states and the counties need to continue to maintain and the trade-off in terms of what I'm thinking about is North Carolina and those bridges to the Outer Banks that continue to be blown down and flooded, and they just keep repairing those. So has there been comparisons of what the money spent by the state and counties in maintaining infrastructure in communities that are facing these huge risks versus new infrastructure in places that are relatively safe?
To my knowledge, no. But perhaps somebody else on this Zoom conference might have a better answer. So I'm not familiar with North Carolina, but I do know that the Maryland Department of Transportation is just starting to think very seriously about this. And we didn't do in-depth interviews with them. It's actually one of the next things I want to do in January is go back to Annapolis and talk to some people at the DOT. But what little conversation we did have with them indicated that they're thinking seriously about whether or not they want to be investing in infrastructure to serve towns that are going to be increasingly inundated. I don't believe, or at least they didn't mention, if anybody had actually done cost-benefit analyses of this decision. I do know that in a lot of state governments, people are under some political pressure specifically not to do that, and so it's kind of stalemate. As far as I know, with my limited experience, just looking at Maryland, I don't know about North Carolina. That's an excellent question. I think that is one of the big questions that needs to be answered is how should we be making decisions about investing in infrastructure in places that are going to be increasingly vulnerable. And I will say this, the people that I talked to, homeowners especially in the Chesapeake, did say that they know there is a time when the state is simply going to stop investing in things like the bridge that comes through their little island. And yet they're still kind of saying that we'll this is not intended to be a pun, cross that bridge when we come to it. But they even talked about things like, well, if they do that, maybe we'll have some sort of a little ferry that can go back and forth, that can take a car or something like that. And so the people are thinking about it, but not seriously.
Thank you.
Hi, this is Stephanie Dahlke, and I wanted to follow up on that comment. And Heidi, it'd be great to actually, maybe we can catch up in person sometime here since we're both with the university. So on that subject, I know that Florida Sea Grant has put together some studies and publications on I met a lawyer, an attorney a couple of weeks ago at a transportation resilience conference. And actually, Katie, I think you organized the panel he was on. So they were looking at what are the liability concerns and the financial risks for municipalities about maintaining or choosing to not maintain infrastructure anymore when it becomes too costly to maintain. And that's on my list of things to look up after that conference as well. But I would also recommend checking out the agenda from the Transportation Resilience Conference, which was organized by the National Academy's Transportation Research Board. There were a lot of case studies where people have actually started to do cost-benefit analyses for infrastructure and improving its resiliency based on flood models and things like that. And I think the program is available to the public, and they've posted some of the slide decks there. But that's a great starting point if you're more interested in seeing what people are actually starting to analyze.
Thanks.
Hi, this is Joyce Coffey. That was amazing. I'm just so thrilled that you were willing to share all of that great intelligence with us. And I agree with Susie that if you did have some references for us, it would be super helpful. So we can actually continue to relay this information to others. But I had a question about your recommendations. Perhaps because you're within the Academy, that's something that's not within your purview. But is there any writing about what those of us who don't know as much about human nature and social sciences should do in order to increase the ability for communities to retreat and also for receiving communities to be ready? Have you done any recommendation papers?
No, not yet. And we haven't looked at receiving communities at all. And that is it's a topic of increasing interest of all the conferences I go to and everything. No, we did a comparison of our Midwest work with the tsunami relocations in Japan, and we published a paper about that has a lot of recommendations in it, but I will put that on the slide deck when I resend it. But no, unfortunately, we don't have anything else to give you.
David, are you aware of any work that has been done in areas of particularly high land values or housing values? I'm dealing with the coast of California, and the area that we're looking at, average price of the home today is $3.5 million. obviously, it won't stay $3.5 million in a market where everybody knows the risk and nobody wants to buy it. The value of a home is only the value you can sell it for. So have you looked at some of those, or aware of anybody who's looked at the dynamics in these high value areas?
No, well, we have not looked at high value areas, and I'm not aware of any other research that has been done, other than two small anecdotes that I can share with you. And one is we did do some tours of Staten Island and parts of Queens, Queens, that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy, and these other structural solutions like elevating your house are more financially viable when you have that much more equity in your house to begin with, and so even if and however, I should point out that people are as unlikely to have flood insurance in places like Long Island and Queens as they are in the Midwest. And I'm trying to think of oh yes, we did speak with a realtor in the Chesapeake, and he's saying that they just are starting to see a very little bit of a signal in people being concerned about some of these higher end homes. And on the Chesapeake, there are a lot of people who are moving from places, retiring especially from places like Washington, D.C., and they are buying homes that are, $1, $2, $3 million, or building homes that are worth that. Believe it or not, they're building homes in some of these areas. And he's saying that there's just a lot of other noise in the market about people's decisions to buy these properties. And even though people will ask questions like, how much might the flood insurance be? He doesn't feel that is actually significantly impacting their decisions yet. But he does feel that probably within the next 4 or 5 years, that you will start to see it be more of a factor in the decision making, with one exception. And that is, if the national flood insurance rates do go up to their real actuarial values, that's when you're going to see a shock to the system. And I have heard economists speak about this at conferences, and they say, keep your eye on Miami, because that's where you're probably going to see that start to happen first. And I think we already are starting to see that in Miami. And they think that when the Miami real estate market really starts to decline because of concerns about sea level rise, you're going to see a domino effect, and they're calling it climate panic. And everybody's trying to avoid climate panic both in the real estate industry and the reinsurance industry. So it's an issue that is just emerging.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This is great. So I know we only have a couple more minutes. This is really fascinating, some really great questions. And I, for one, learned a new term, climate panic, to kind of describe what I've been sort of seeing and hearing about myself. So that's really good. So David, thank you so much for being willing to speak to us. We really appreciate it. I just wanted to take briefly, just briefly mention next month in early January, we're hoping to have Julie Maldonado join us, and we're hoping to have a multi-panel discussion discussing Indigenous responses to the issues of managed retreat and climate migration. As we know, Indigenous populations have a lot of unique sensitivities to this issue, and a lot of differing opinions, and we're hoping to be able to actually express that. So look forward to that. Does anybody else have anything they want to mention for the good of the order of the group? Okay. Well, I think that's it. I'll make sure we give everyone back about 3 minutes of their time today. Again, thank you, David, and thank you, everyone, for joining us. And hopefully see as many of you as possible in January, and tell your friends. Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
David, thank you so much. That was phenomenal.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Patrick and David, are you still on?
I am
This is
still
Caroline
on.
Lebo.
I'll wait.
I actually just thought of a question, sorry, about 20 seconds late. And that is, this could also be something we chat about offline if it's easier, but I am trying to explore the world of nonprofits working on the issue of managed retreat in the United States. And I've been really coming up with very few who are focused on managed retreat exclusively, especially from a kind of locally specific context. So I'm really looking for any directions you might be able to provide for where I can find nonprofits doing locally specific work on retreat.
So I met a few people at the conference. It was up at Yale University almost a year ago. It was climigration. It was a climate migration conference. And I met a few people up there. I'll look for I have their contact information. But there was a nonprofit, and they were particularly interested in working with people from the Marshall Islands. So I know there's about 75,000 Marshallese on the face of the planet, and 25,000 of them live in the United States. And we have a compact of free association, and so it's pretty obvious that the other 50,000 of them will probably be coming to the United States. And she's actually looking at the possibility of helping them settle in places in the Midwest, and that's how I got to talking with her. Most of the Marshallese who are in the United States are in Springdale, Arkansas. And I know this because I did a small project on them about 12 years ago. So she's interested in that aspect of managed retreat at the national scale, Republic of the Marshall Islands. I'll send you her contact information. And the other person, have you talked at all with Robert Moore of the Natural Resources Defense Council?
You know, his name sounds familiar, but I haven't spoken with him directly.
So he's been heavily involved in the idea of lobbying for legislation to encourage people to relocate out of floodplains so they can be restored to natural wetlands. And so that's the NRDC sort of approach on it. He might have contacts, more local contacts.
This is Beth Gibbons. I think that David's suggestions about the Climigration Network are good. It sounds like you may already be connected. Are you connected with the Climigration Network?
Yes.
Okay. So I think
my understanding is that they have connections to a lot of very small local groups, not all of which are focused on retreat, and that they are more of a national scale group focused on retreat. So I'm kind of looking for groups almost doing the practitioner level kind of ethnographic research that David and team has done, but in a nonprofit capacity, if that makes sense, as opposed to an academic one.
But I think that.
But go ahead, Beth. These suggestions are so helpful.
Yeah, I think that Harriet Festerings group may be a good suggestion.
Sorry, you broke up for 1 second. What group were you talking about?
Harriet Festering, the Anthropocene Alliance.
Yep.
I would look at that.
Yeah, they've given grants out to a few groups that I've earmarked, so they're helpful actually as a grant giver too.
And then I would consider whether or not the Louisiana Foundation and working through Liz Russell Williams. Those are all names, parts of her name. The first is Liz, and the other parts are Russell.
In whatever order.
Yeah, and then next month when Julie Maldonado is on, I think that she could be a really valuable contact. I think what Julie does and is a really important voice that is getting a concern I have in some conversations around managed retreat that is taking place in the country is that conversations around migration, environmental migration, and movement have been happening for a very long time in Indigenous communities and in frontline communities, and there isn't as much, I think, coming together in the conversations that have been had in those Indigenous communities and communities of color and new research. And Julie does just a great job of straddling that boundary, and I think being communities and conversations together. So she could also connect you with community-based organizations in tribes in frontline communities who have been working on this topic for, a decade or decades.
That's an
Thank
excellent
you.
suggestion.
No, that would be truly excellent to connect with her.
In fact, she works for a nonprofit involved in relocation.
Yeah.
And also,
do you know the name?
I don't know the name off the top of my head. I can't remember.
Yeah.
And it just occurred to me, the Eastern Shore Land Conservancy on the Chesapeake is also a nonprofit that's very much involved in issues of managed retreat, but more political lobbying now that I think about it. But Brian Ambred, I noticed on the list of members of ASAP, he's actually a member. Although I don't think he works here anymore.
Although he just moved to Maine.
Went to Maine, but his successor.
But I could be happy to introduce you to Brian. If you reached out to me, Ellen, and I don't know, David, if you're willing to do this too, I'd be happy to introduce you to Julie, Brian, and Harriet, who could all be good folks to kind of build from.
That would be so helpful, Beth. I will give you my email address if that's all right, or if you want to give me yours, I'll shoot
I just
you a
put
note.
my email address in the chat.
I hate to say this, but my my Zoom has been frozen the entire time we've been speaking. So I'm looking at Patrick's face from minute 1 of the conversation still.
Oh, no.
So I can't actually see the chat either.
Okay. I will find another way to get in touch with you. Although you could also find my email on the website, on ASAP's website. So yeah,
I'm happy to do that.
If you email me, then I can make those contacts happen. That's
Thank
my
you, Beth.
superpower. My superpower is helping people find the things they need to do their job. So.
Well,
David,
I'm so glad that we connected today.
David, this is Jack Leapster, and I just wanted to thank you for bringing up the issue of compassion and treating folks with some kind of empathy. And I agree with you entirely that that's really integral to making these kind of things work. And so if you don't mind, I'd like to, either chat or exchange emails with you offline to see how I can learn more about how to bring that into the practice.
Yeah, I'd love to talk more about it. I didn't mention this idea that when people participate in the process of planning their new community, it's empowering, and it's something that gives them a lot of hope, and actually empowers them to participate in democracy. It's participatory based community fill in the blank planning or whatever, policy, budgeting. This idea that when people are involved, and this again is this idea that the way the system is set up now, it's set up to turn neighbor against neighbor, and because it's not looking at the level of the community. And when you look at the whole community and you try to make this be a process by which the community is making a decision and finding their own way of coming to consensus, it actually becomes something that's beneficial, it's empowering, and it actually increases quality of life. And like I said, in Valmeyer, people aren't totally happy. They miss the old community and all this other kind of stuff. But they do talk a lot about process, much more than the actual outcome, and how important it was to feel that they were important and part of the decision-making process.
Well, thank you again very much for your presentation. Now, I'll try to be in touch. Thanks.
Okay, I have to go.
Great. Well, thank you so much, David.
Thank you.
Really appreciate your presentation. And I'm sure other questions will come your way. Have a great rest of your afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, David and Beth. I'll reach out to you both to ask about those names. I really appreciate your help.
Okay.
And thanks, Carolyn.
All right.
Bye-bye.